All right, thank you very much for that introduction. And as was noted, I am the consumer acceptance part. So focus panels, surveys, and sensory panels are all within my realm. And I work with food engineers and food innovators, just as we've heard, to find out about the acceptability of their innovations. That was a good sound, yeah. Thank you. Oh, stuck. There we go. So I have no commercial relationships that are relevant to the subject. So novel food technology, certainly 3D. But we also have a lot of plant-based foods, insect-based foods in the form of whole insects or insect flour, cell-cultured meat, as we've discussed, personalized foods, upcycled foods, so using waste products or products that would normally go for waste and incorporating them into foods, and also gene-edited foods. And we have all these great innovations. You know, we've talked about sustainability and personal health and health of communities. But unless those innovations are taken up by consumers, they're really not going to be, you know, accepted and move forward, no matter how many benefits they might provide. So the technology success in the market depends on consumer perception of their benefits and risks. So when we think about just 3D food printing, it has been very, very successful in many aspects. When we look at commercially available 3D printed food products, we find that there are some incredibly beautiful, intricate pasta shapes that are available for both chefs and for people at home. We see incredibly detailed confectionery shapes, things that could not be made with molds or piping or anything else. And we have really fun foods. This is a bomb, and you just drop it into your drink and it falls apart and it provides great color and flavor. You can buy little teddy bears made of chocolate and you drop them into your hot coffee or your hot milk, and they don't explode. They just dissolve as a teddy bear should, because that would be acceptable to the consumer, and give you a sweet treat before bed, that kind of thing. There are a lot of premium and customized foods that can be made with 3D printing. So it's really taken molecular gastronomy to another level for chefs who have that interest. In terms of cell cultured meat, which is not a technology that all consumers find acceptable, you do have this incredible ability to use dual extrusion. So Jonathan showed us a little video with single extrusion and building layer by layer that shape. Well, with a dual head extruder, you can be depositing two things more or less at one time, like a really intricate weaving design. And you can weave your fat stream and your meat cell stream and end up with something like this sort of consistent presentation of a meat product. And 3D food printing technology has also been successful in terms of healthcare, particularly around making foods that have desirable shapes. So you can take pureed broccoli and you can just dump it on someone's plate, or you can put it into a mold, and that's a little bit nicer, or you can print it out and you can get this really incredible detail of the flowerets. So are we ready though for a kitchen countertop appliance that is a 3D food printer? This is the Cuisinart kitchen countertop collection, and you know from your own experience that there are many appliances that heat liquids, brew beverages, things like that. Then there are many that cook foods, reheat, so the Instant Pot, a rice cooker, an air fryer, etc. And then we have another category of appliances that do a lot of mixing and particle reduction. But are we ready for a tabletop or countertop 3D food printer? So would you like one of those, the stated space technology for your own home? So as these are introduced to consumers, how do they respond? They have the opportunity to purchase the 3D printed foods, and now they can also purchase the appliances. So will there be this great joy and delight, or will it be a more negative response? And I think those that have been real proponents of 3D food printers in the home have said, well, so many of us have a little paper printer in the home. How could we resist something like this? Surely it will be similar. So I wonder, what is your opinion if you'd like to contemplate that? And how many of you have tasted 3D printed foods? Just a couple, yeah. And would you taste them if you could? So that could have been a good snack, actually, at one of the breaks. And would you invite or would you have a 3D food printer in your home? And then what differentiates individuals who are really accepting, embracing, want to adopt the 3D food printing technology from those who say, no, thank you. So we'll look at some of those things today. So my aim is to describe consumer acceptance and perception of 3D printed foods, and also suggest a few methods to enhance its acceptance and that of other novel food technologies. And in doing so, I'll talk a little bit about my background, then I'll get into that information and also describe some of the methods that we use to determine the acceptance of the technology, and then talk a little bit about suggestions to enhance consumer acceptance. So just to give you an idea of the context and the biases that I bring to this topic, I have only been working on 3D printed foods for, I'd say, maybe 6 or 7 years. And we had a food engineer in our little food science and technology division who was a real proponent of 3D food printing, and he had some research funding. And he was smart enough to realize, he said, the things we do in the lab, if no one is interested in the products and the technology, they're not going to be successful. So we did quite a few studies looking at both the capabilities and also consumer acceptance. And one of the studies we did to start was simply to take kind of unusual or rare food products and present them as conventional and 3D printed. And in part, we did that because, as Jonathan has pointed out, it can take a long time to print a food using 3D food printing technology. And if we wanted to have a lot of consumer participants, we needed to use something that wasn't so familiar to most people. So we had things, special sort of gummy treats from Easter and Happy Face smiley potatoes that you could only get at one store in Edmonton. And what we found in a nutshell was that those who were most positively inclined towards 3D food printing were those who had a low level of what we call food technology neophobia. So they were not really fearful of new technologies, but rather they tended to embrace them. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these two studies where a graduate student surveyed 3D food printing adopters around the globe and found that they were real food innovators, and also an industry survey in Alberta where we found that there wasn't a lot of uptake from the food processing industry, but rather there was great interest from healthcare. And I put these little icons here just to remind myself to tell you that I also work in novel foods. So we developed some images with labeling and information about cricket-based snacks. And we're also looking at developing food products from upcycled beef hides. With the great interest in vegan leather, we actually have a glut of unwanted beef hides that are available, and because they're consumed in other parts of the world, there would be no reason why we couldn't consume them in Alberta, other than the cost of meat is relatively low. So that would be the limit. We also did some studies about benefits in terms of health. So one of our first studies was to layer high sugar and low sugar chocolate. And we found that just by doing the layers in the shape of our 3D printed product, we could reduce the sugar content by 18% and still have an acceptable chocolate that had the same perceived sugar intensity as the high sweet chocolate. We are currently developing a little high nutrient density, protein enriched saliva eliciting nutritious snack from a protein-based formulation that is 3D printed to make it more attractive. And we're also going to ask this question about if we present something that has a clear sort of food base to it, so let's say it's mostly chicken, would consumers be more interested in consuming a printed shape that is shaped like a chicken, or do they prefer something else, such as a snowflake, that is really intricate and a more perhaps rewarding eating experience? So that came out of the suggestion that even the better looking pureed broccoli still was not that attractive. And maybe if we could build something more interesting, it would be more desirable. Oh, we're back. All right. So some of the acceptance. So as we've heard, and as I've mentioned, we've really moved from this visual aspect of 3D printed foods, that kind of wow factor with the intricate designs, candy, pasta, chocolates, and trying to move the product forward. So interest in home appliances. So there are different quotes you can find online where people envision essentially that 3D food printers will be part of the Cuisinart appliance option. So why would you have a 3D food printer at home? To customize food products, you could really personalize it, add photos, add people's names, add nutrients of interest to you. You can target nutritional needs, and that may be very important in terms of addressing nutrition across the lifespan. So the very young or more older individuals, attractive pureed foods. It's suggested that 3D food printing is very sustainable, low waste, that you use. You can purchase food cartridges and you print that out and you're not making any extra, although there is a great movement as well to use leftovers from the refrigerator and turn them into food products as well as upcycled foods. And that there's a certain amount of self-actualization as a creative hobby from 3D food printing. So two of my students own 3D food printers, and they are also real diehard foodies. They cook things from scratch, and yet at the same time, they're very interested in looking at the designs and seeing what the printer can do for them. So will we move from the Cuisinart kitchen tabletop appliance type thing into this type of product? And you can see in this scenario, there is the 3D printer and it's printing out all these great looking products, but our consumer is still also going to consume some familiar food products. So a little bit different from the Star Trek food replicator that just automatically made everything you wanted. This would involve a lot more personal design. And these are the motivations that I pretty much mentioned that would direct people to purchase 3D food printers. And in this particular article online, they talked about the barriers might still be high initial costs. So with technological advances, certainly the cost of the technology has come down, but it's still expensive. Some of those things we've heard about the regulations for new products, if you're selling cartridges with a kind of a meat formulation to go into your 3D food printer, that'll take quite a bit of regulation. And then consumer acceptance is still indicated as a possible barrier, and it certainly is. So one of my students did some focus groups with early adopters of 3D printing technology. They were all successful business entrepreneurs, and they really felt that 3D printing offered them advantages relative to the technologies they were previously using. And really the advantages were unique to each food sector. So it's not easy to say, oh, well, it's easily applied here and not here. It really depended on how the innovator saw it benefiting them. And they really were innovators. They needed to be people who were willing to take software and move it into 3 different programs and then print things out. So in that sense, there is that little bit of a barrier for some consumers. If using a lot of software and getting into that type of thing isn't your thing, it will be challenging. And their concerns about the future were that there would be low consumer acceptance because of simply low awareness, as we've seen for 3D food printing technology. negative perceptions and an unwillingness to pay for expensive products. And just an example of negative perceptions, I know it's easy to just say, oh yeah, nobody's interested, but we had a day where we invited people in to come and see our 3D food printers, and we had little talks and things, and there was great interest. And then when you went through the group and talked to people, you found out really they were all tech innovators. Some of them had never worked with food, but they just wanted to see a 3D food printing machine. And the media was there. I gave several interviews, and I remember I was so excited I was going to listen to this interview with a local radio station. And this fellow said, yeah, you know, I went out to this display, I interacted, I saw these 3D food printers. And the host was like, ooh, 3D food printing, that sounds terrible. You know, isn't it highly processed? Isn't it unnecessary, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, those negative perceptions are alive and well. So 3D food printing, as I mentioned, is one of the many novel technologies that I think are part of this industry 4.0, where we've had great technological changes in order to meet health needs and develop sustainable products. And we've been able to incorporate a lot of these enablers like AI and blockchain, the Internet of Things, et cetera. And the challenge here is we're developing a lot of products that didn't exist a short time ago. So I think there was a reference to familiarity, maybe in the previous 3D food printing talk. But certainly if products aren't familiar to individuals, they're more reluctant to take them on. And that can be one of the challenges for the cell cultured food products is you have two different dimensions there of challenge. So the actual cell culture, which is a new area for individuals, and then putting those cells through a 3D food printer. Now, you know, you've got two layers of innovation that are creating a food product that, even though it's meant to be a substitute for something you know, might be perceived as just a little bit too distant. So I have three different examples here of sort of the assessment of new technologies. And this first one is based on the Technology Acceptance Model, or TAM, that was developed in 1989. And it's advanced over time a bit, but it essentially says, you know, for a consumer to be interested in any new technology, they would be interested in the perceived usefulness of the technology, the perceived ease of use. Together, that will determine their attitude, and that will dictate their behavioral intention towards the new technology. So one of the things I think you can imagine with the 3D food printing is that if someone offered you that opportunity for that appliance in your home, you might say, well, you know, I don't really have a need for that. And also it turns out it's not all that easy to use all of the time. It does require some manipulation, some technology know-how. So even though we may be excited, we can see that there are these quite obvious barriers for some. With respect to food products specifically, there are a couple of food consumer scientists who said, well, for novel foods, these would be the barriers: a lack of familiarity, sometimes a sense of disgust, and this holds particularly true for insect-based food products and things that don't seem so much like food, or some of the upcycled foods, particularly as we advertise, oh, you know, this is made from food that's been diverted from a landfill. This could be waste. That's not really an attractive statement for a lot of people. A lack of perceived naturalness, and also food neophobia and food technology neophobia. And food neophobia is just a personal sort of fear or maybe a reluctance to adopt new food products. And then food technology neophobia is that reluctance to adopt foods from new technologies. So all of these combine together to provide some resistance or reluctance to adopt new food technologies. So it's quite complex in the mind of the consumer. We have those practical questions. Am I going to use it? Is it going to be hard to use? You know, what's it going to do for me? And then I'm going to think about all of these other things as well. So food technology neophobia is something that's very popular, a very popular concept, because it can be quantified from a survey. there are 13 different items or questions, and sample items would be, there are plenty of tasty foods around, so we don't need to use new food technologies to produce more. And also, it can be risky to switch to new food technologies so quickly. So how a person responds on a scale of disagree extremely to agree extremely will influence their total score, where the greater the score, the more reluctant they are to take on these new food technologies. But usually what's used with this scale is to look at the scores and then classify people as food technology neophobes or food technology neophiles. And the neophiles, of course, are the ones that are more willing to take on the technology. And once we've done that, we can look at some of the other attitudinal questions, maybe the things that are more difficult to assess, and learn more about our individuals and their potential adoption that way. So this is very commonly used with novel food products. Naturalness, which I mentioned is a factor in the acceptance or rejection of novel food technologies, is really difficult to measure because it's this latent construct. It's this thing in your mind, and your impression of it or your definition of it may change as a function of the food you're evaluating, where you are, etc. So some researchers were looking at seaweed-based foods in Norway, and they determined that in order to measure the naturalness of the seaweed-based food products, they would need to measure a healthy dimension, an organic dimension, and also a natural dimension, where the dimensions were measured on 7-point scales, where the endpoints were unhealthy and healthy, non-organic and organic, and synthetic and natural. So clearly quite a complicated construct to measure. And as I said, it will vary with each food product. So a couple of students wrote a review, a couple of students of mine wrote a review, and they tried to pull all of this and more together. And so we have, you know, the perceptions and acceptance of 3D printed foods and the technology. And really what we have around the outside are all these different attributes, but really it's everything. You know, it's everything about a person that's going to influence their acceptance or not. So we've got personality traits, you know, the fear of the new food, psychological factors, perceptions of naturalness, the product characteristics, am I going to use it or not, technology characteristics, and the demographic factors. So really there are just so many things that make it very difficult to predict who will take on 3D printed foods and the technology. So how might we enhance acceptance? I think we've heard a little bit of this today. Focus on products and their benefits rather than the technology. I know as a food scientist, when I think about working with my colleagues, you know, we're so pro technology, but that's not necessarily the part the consumer wants to hear. You know, what's in it for me? What's the perceived usefulness? And this idea that products are processed, you know, that question about, yes, when things go through a 3D food printer, yes, they are processed, you bet. You know, if it comes out of a tube or it goes into a mold, it's processed. That said, you know, there are a lot of benefits that can be added, such as personalized nutrient content and nutrient density. Really focusing on the technology with individuals who are interested. So I mentioned the early adopters, people who are willing to engage with technology. Targeting familiar and accepted products. So when you think about the most accepted products, we've got pasta, candy, drink bombs because they're fun, and then a couple of areas where there's a need. I mean, those are things that are familiar and we can see a clear benefit. Consumer education, you know, that idea that it isn't a replicator, that it's a little bit more complicated, but it has lots of benefits. Avoiding technical terminology. In fact, many of the people we interviewed suggested that we not call it 3D food printing, that printing is not something that's done to food, you know, it makes colored paper, etc. So what would be another name that would be more acceptable than food printing? and providing consumer printer interaction opportunities. I think right now for most people, a 3D food printer is something that, it lives somewhere else, maybe in the Natick labs or something like that, and providing opportunities for the printing process to become more familiar. So in conclusion, I think that while we get excited about a lot of these technologies and we have this technological push and we've aimed our products to meet what we perceive our consumer needs, so sustainability and health for foods and food production systems, we really won't get that acceptance unless we acknowledge consumer perceptions and direct the technologies and their marketing, et cetera, to be more acceptable to consumers. Finding that sweet spot between that technological push of a development and then consumer demand. Because we've identified that we have consumer demand in these attributes, and we've got this technological push for the 3D printing, but they're just not coming together. So we need, I think, a little bit more education and refinement in order to make sure that the needs of both groups are met. And that concludes my presentation. Question.
Thanks so much. It was a really interesting presentation. One of the things that I'm very curious about is things that can derail technology as you actually get it into the consumer's hands. So obviously with 3D printing, FAF, if you can maybe get to a point of acceptance of the technology of the product. But like when I think about like a 3D art on the shelf, then the question is like, what about getting consumers' perceptions of things like around safety or just safety concerns? Or what about understanding like maybe the product's great, but it's a pain in the butt to clean. And so that's going to limit adoption. Is there a way to kind of get out ahead of like, I guess what would be, if you want to call it sort of a home use test, to kind of understand those risks and how to mitigate them as we move from kind of like lab technology to home technology?
Thank you for that question. The first thing that popped into mind were the wily warriors. And I thought, well, we'll just set up all these printers and we'll print the stuff out and we'll let it sit around and they can taste it. We'll see who lives and who doesn't. But that's a really important aspect. So, we've also heard novel foods and their products need that sort of regulatory acceptance or regulatory approval. And that is one of the considerations. And there is, in fact, a whole area of research with 3D printed food around making it safer. So looking at things like the use of blue light to destroy microbes as the product is printed and after printing, some post-processing cooking, things like that are going to reduce the water activity. And I think that is a really complicating factor. And although we'll say things like, oh, you could take your leftovers, put them in the cartridge and print them out. At what point after the leftovers been sitting out and the cartridge has been sitting out, at what point does that start to become a hazard? So that's a really important element. And it would only take just one unfortunate incident for that to be the end of the appreciation of that technology. So yeah, that would be something that I should add to the slides as a barrier. Absolutely.
Have you in the back? Have you looked into starting maybe in restaurants as opposed to starting at home? If you think about some of the appliances that have been adapted to kitchen top counters, think about espresso machines. First you had them in the coffee shop and then you brought them at home. And you could imagine that chefs in restaurants could do a lot more with the 3D printer and start to customize dishes on an individual basis with a lot more culinary expertise to create unique restaurant experiences which consumers then want to replicate in home.
Yes, that's a good point. So when we interviewed sort of our global leaders or innovators in 3D food printing technology, one of them was a restaurateur in Europe, actually. And that was, he thought it was the greatest invention. You know, it was his signature dishes were really unique presentations along the lines of molecular gastronomy. And we had thought when we did our more local survey for the province of Alberta that we would get a lot more interest. And I think part of the lack of interest in our area was that those who are restaurateurs are too busy to answer our survey, participate in our interviews, or even come to our workshops where we show the technology. So I'm not sure how to make that happen. I mean, maybe it's more through industry associations or something like that. I had also invited some of the chocolatiers in our city to come and see the printer. And again, a couple were busy, and one fellow said, you know, it's just, it wouldn't be unique. So although he could program and he could get unique chocolates, he said his current technique, he adds, it's almost like painting on the chocolate. He felt that that was more unique than what the 3D food printer could offer at this point. So I think yes, but currently no. Yes. Oh,
we have two quick questions online.
sure.
Esther Myers says that the concept of naming the technology with more familiar terms seems important. So have other names been considered than, I guess, a 3D printing?
Not to my knowledge, but maybe there is a NATIC experience with another name for the product. And I think the challenge to calling it printing is everybody knows what printing is. You know, as I mentioned, most people have a printer in their home if they, well, not most, but many people do, but it somehow isn't a fit. So I would really be interested in your ideas about what would be an alternative name.
And then one other quick question from Jeffrey Farber. In your readings/studies, have you or others identified any unique potential food safety risks with 3D printing food?
We have not, but I think, as I mentioned, that is a real growing area. So the need for processing control, either with blue light or the post-printing baking or dehydration or something like that, and then looking very carefully at what gets printed. You know, chocolate is one thing that dries quickly, but doing a protein-rich snack or something like that that has sufficient moisture that it can be extruded can be, I think, a bit of a risk. Not a bit of a risk, a risk.
You had an example, I believe it was a candy bar with an 18% sugar reduction.
Yeah.
Did that take into consideration the consumer awareness or perception, or were they able to notice that there was a formulation change?
Oh, so alas, we did not have a consumer study where we presented labels or things like that. So this is another one of those things where it was really slow to get them all printed out. So we could only have a few people come in at a time. And we focused very much on different sort of layering and shapes and the orientation of the chocolate into the mouth. And we evaluated all of the sensory attributes. Actually, we had chocolate melting, chocolate flavor intensity, while the chocolate was held in the mouth. So just with that, that was kind of enough for us to do at one time. But I think, you know, with the label, it would seem to me that if you could advertise a reduction in sugar with that same great taste, it would be quite popular.